So last night or the day before, we were doing Geoscope. There was a couple of people in the comments talking about a situation that had been developing apparently on Novara Media. Now, I, I am aware of Novara Media. I'm not, I do have my criticisms of them. They're not my go-to news source, to be honest. Um, but I dip my toe in there from time to time, see what's going on. But yesterday, this was talked about a lot. That they had written an incredibly um, tanky piece on foreign policy, and quite frankly, you know me, I can't resist. Like I can't resist when we get to see these types of things get explored because it's very clear most of the people do not really have an understanding of foreign policy or well, what the implications of what they're talking about even mean. And I am by no means an expert in foreign policy. Indeed, I would say I am very enthusiastic about foreign policy, and I am always trying to actively learn about more foreign policy and how that obviously affects and shapes the sort of the UK and what that happens and international relations. It's a very fascinating thing, but if you do have a look into this, you really do realize there are not a lot of left wing commentators like out there that talk about this. It is very, very much right dominated. And I've said this before, there are areas and topics and subjects that the left just dare not or does not talk about. Or if it does, it's like one tiny minute thing, and then they ignore it and then go on to something else. But yeah, I think I've done that video in the past, so I can't remember what it's called now, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. But yeah, so we're going to have a look at this. I haven't read it, so you're going to be getting my fresh reaction from this on this. So this will be, I'm sure, fun. So before we do go into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. Down below, there is my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there's the Pony Club down below. And of course, you can click the like and share button as well. So let's have a crack into this then. So Trump trashing the world order could have its upsides. I'd love to know what these upsides are going to be. Anyway, the past week has seen the most decisive reordering of the international order since the fall of the Soviet Union. From the end of the Second World War, the United States has now positioned itself as a guarantor of European defense against the presumed threat from the East. The presumed threat from the East. I think it shows you really this guy didn't really have or has had a look at stuff that people in the Soviet Union said about what they wanted to do with Europe, or or maybe the stuff Vladimir Putin has said about what he believes his sphere of influence should be, and he should be able to dictate and steer Europe as he sees fit. Yeah, it's just a presumed threat from the East. Don't worry about it, guys. Just a presumed threat. Anyway, first, of course, for Europe against the Soviet Union, and then in the late 1990s for the East against Russia. President Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, have made very clear this no longer applies. NATO will still exist as a structure, but the US will not come to Europe's military aid and is insisting on NATO's members ramping up defense spending. And the resulting panic and disorganization amongst European leaders is all too visible. Yeah, for good reason. For good reason, because we have always pretty much known that Article 5 is there. Key sort of point for European, defense ideas that America was always there. And even the Danish Prime Minister came out and said it yesterday. She had a fantastic speech where they were all with Zelensky. She said, we are all going to have to accept the reality now. We're going to have to all increase our defense spending. Like everyone in Europe is doing that now. They're having that conversation. we are now seeing more talks again about European strategic autonomy. They keep on bringing that word up because that is what is happening. That is what everyone is now moving towards. How can we achieve this? Where can we achieve this? What can we do to assure that we don't have to rely on the US as much? So this was directly tied to now the hegemony of force that was the US's role as an economic hegemon. As the US has acted now as a provider of the world's most important currency, the dollar, the US borrowing has now sustained economic growth across the rest of the world. It is the removal of the barriers to trade and the flow of money around the world under the guise of neoliberalism that cemented its position and made a lot of countries a lot more wealthy. Like, I don't like, the capitalist world system. I think it certainly needs a lot more check and balances. I think we need a lot more redistribution going on. But to say that growth, that economic access, and that borrowing hasn't had good consequences for a lot of other countries, yeah. And bear in mind, what other currency are we going to rely on? And how can you be sure that those other countries that maybe have that currency are going to be good actors, or should we say good people to be in debt to is the better question. After all, we've seen what China's done with the Belt and Road Initiative. So anyway, I'm sure that doesn't have any foreboding about what may be coming, because I can only see he's mentioning China in the comment in the forthcoming comments. So, critically, this included now the growing integration of China into the US-centered economy from the mid-70s onwards. From the viewpoint of the US capitalism, this worked, and by the mid-2000s, the US was now the world's absolutely dominant power, militarily and economically. Okay, so now what? So the failure of Iraq on one side followed shortly after by the 2008 financial crash ended the good times. The major economic crises in the US and across Europe cleared the path for China, already growing rapidly, to achieve parity and even overtake the Western economies now in key areas, most obviously with renewable and electric vehicles. So we should all go to China because they're now building renewables and electric vehicles. Just anyway, countries across the global south, from Brazil to Angola, are now becoming increasingly tied into a Chinese-centric trading model, supplying raw materials essential for its growth, while Chinese investment in turn spreads across much of the globe. And that would be, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. But the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't know if this guy's ever looked into the Belt and Road Initiative, has a lot of caveats, shall we say, for those countries that do get in debt to China, and what that eventually means, that they are very, very much permanently in the hock. Because if you, I don't know, maybe go against China at a UN vote, all of a sudden China might call in those debts or say no more money for you, and then that puts your country in a bit of a problem. Then at that point, doesn't it? Anyway, by 2015, Washington now was already beginning to fret about the emergence now of its first peer competitor. And again, I think we should be saying this: is China actually a peer competitor when it comes to America? Because we were told by a lot of these people that Russia was clearly a peer-to-peer adversary with America. Yet we've seen economically that's certainly not the case, and militarily that's also certainly not the case. When you look at China is very, very underdeveloped. Like, there's only something like 12% of China is like actually economically properly developed in the way that we Westerners would understand or look at an area. That's not the case for the rest of China. And you look at the Chinese economy, you look at a lot of people saying, well, actually, China is in a bit of a problem at the moment because it's still struggling to try and come out of COVID effectively. Not only that, what does this mean for maybe its military? After all, China, if you look at how its military has progressed, it has somewhat gone in the same way that Russia's did in ensuring, shall we say, loyalty to state and party was massively prioritized over, capability. Not only that, but it's not like China is dominating any international markets when it comes to, well, selling of weapons or anything like that. So you have to ask, well, what is actually the real state of well, Chinese weaponry? What can it actually really do? And when it's been seen in action, it hasn't been that too successful, shall we say? But there you go. So Trump's first presidency, of course, marked the first significant US break with the neoliberal rules of the game, stepping up the trade tariffs against China. Biden's presidency merely reinforced this, making greater use of the legal sanctions against Chinese companies, including bars on technology transfer, while also spending heavily domestically to try and outcompete China in a few key industries like semiconductors and renewables. But that's a good thing. Like, that is a good thing. One of the big things we have to compete against, and this is something that should be understood. How can you keep jobs here and manufacturing jobs here in the UK or provide jobs if China can just, because it's got a big population, is really what is driving its productivity. It has that product, it's nothing to do with its manufacturing or anything like that. It because it has such a large population, they can just, produce pretty much non-stop. Um, how do you then compete against, let's say, China just dumping a load of very cheap products on the shores of the UK? And what does then that mean for UK businesses? How does that affect UK businesses? I do not hear that a lot talked about from people on the left in the UK. Now, that is a problem. Like, how do you fight against that? Right? What do we do? Never heard a single person on the left talk about that. That is worrying. Like, we should be talking about that. That should be something that gets discussed, but it's not. Anyway, Trump version is, of course, now even to further expansion of the deepening of this approach, to a point now of breaking now its long-standing commitments to its historical closest allies. Faced with now serious competition, Washington's response has been forced to retreat and re-entrench. Trump's now attempted deal with Russia over Ukraine has been seen in this light. The greatest triumph of geopolitical strategy in the last 5 decades was to divide Russia and China, isolating two potential rivals. But Western sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Crimea in 2014 and then Ukraine in 2020 has helped bring those two countries into far closer alignment. They do a lot more trading, but let's be honest here. It hasn't, shall we say, been on friendly terms. It's been because they've forced to do that. And let's say this: China is buying Russian oil and gas at a absolute fraction of a price. An absolute fraction of a price. They're not buying it at the price Russia would like, shall we say. So let's be honest about that and the realities of the trade between Russia and China. So trade between Russia and China has surged, of course, in the last decade. And 2 days before the Russian tanks crossed the border with Ukraine, a new close relationship was formalized with the announcement of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin of, quote, an unlimited partnership signed in Beijing. Well, what does that actually mean, an unlimited partnership? Because so far, China has not been willing to get involved in Ukraine or help Russia in that regard. Like, they have not been willing. They've been actively worried against getting involved because they do not want Chinese companies to start being sanctioned, because then that would be a big problem for their economy. So, by setting up talks with Russia directly, notably in Saudi Arabia, A long-time US ally itself, with now increasingly close trade and investment with and diplomatic relations with China over the future of Ukraine, the Trump administration is now hoping to reverse the last decade, pull Russia closer and push China further away. Well, again, that's not really how you do it. I think that's a very bad reading of the situation, to be honest, but there you go. China has, of course, repeatedly signaled its willingness to act as a neutral peacemaker in Ukraine and even mooted sending peacekeeping troops. This person has no clue about what China has done. Yeah, that Chinese neutral actor and its peacemaker in Ukraine is basically giving Russia everything it wants. Like the Chinese peace plan was, there's everything you go, Russia, take it, just end this war now, and we'll guarantee the peace for you by sending our troops there to the border. um hmm, yeah, oh yeah, total neutral actor in this. Anyway, its exclusion from the talks is an international snub. On China's side, at least, is now clear willingness of the Trump administration, for all its rhetoric, to strike a trade deal is at least a significant incentive to allow the US-Russia deal making to continue. And really, that's one of the big things. This deal making. These sanctions should be kept on to sort of make sure that Russia does follow through on any peace agreement that goes through. The deal, of course, currently looks strikingly brutal. Demands for reparations from the US and a near unlimited access to Ukraine's mineral wealth on one side, with Russian territorial gains formalized on the other. It is an old school imperial carve up of the kind that wasn't supposed to happen in the post world order. Exactly. That's why so many people are outraged about this. Even China. You're not mentioning, of course, that China is in itself alarmed at this. Because here's the thing, it wants Taiwan. It wants Taiwan bad. It is jonesing for Taiwan. However, when eventually it does get to take Taiwan, it wants it to be seen by the rest of the world as just restoring a natural part of its territory. It doesn't want to be seen as this imperialist land grab. So it is looking at what Russia has done, what it intended to do to Taiwan, and now looking at it aghast that there has been such a negative reaction to this, and that Russia is essentially fluffing up its plans to what it would like to do to Taiwan. That is why it has not been very happy with this deal that has been put forward. It initially, like I say, to the beginning of this war, did put forward a very pro-Russia peacekeeping idea. Since then, it has said nothing in regards to this subject, but it has constantly said, oh, we hope this war comes to an end. That is what they've been repeating since. So again, China, hardly a neutral actor or a peacemaker in this Ukraine situation on this. So, as climate changes start to bite and resources constraints tighten, we should expect more of these very direct carve up, of course, by the major powers. Resource. Wow, I like that this guy's like future foreign policy analysis is, oh, don't worry, guys. Yeah, resource wars. Like, what? Yeah. Oh, yeah. We should absolutely just that blows my mind that this guy is okay with major powers doing that. Um, Increasingly, of course, diplomatic and military conflicts are likely to zero in, of course, on the issue of raw material access. Trump has made that very clear, for example, that he intends to use the US now growing fossil fuel exports as a bargaining chip in future deals across the world. It seems likely that the UK government will be willing to strike a deal for US liquefied natural gas to now curry favor with Washington. Yeah, we've seen that before. That is probably what will be on the deal. It's probably what Starmer will be talking about probably today, is that those talks are happening today. The US's now unilateral retreat from the rules and institutions it was championed is now necessarily disruptive, but it carries high risks of future conflict. Yes, it does. That's why it's so bad that this is happening, particularly as resource constraints now bind. Well, what resources are being constrained? Because if anything, that is where international trade does come into play here. That countries should trade with each other, and that these types of things should be dealt with in a very diplomatic way. That is the rules-based international order. Anyway, that it also contains the possibility of doing things very differently. Remaking the world system so it is now less less obviously exploitative and motivated by zero-sum competition. How do you do that? Because China ain't China's Belt and Road Initiative is pretty exploitative and isn't motivated by a competition either. It wants those resources. It wants stuff. That's what the whole Belt and Road Initiative was about. But there you go. Britain could, of course, take the opportunity to radically, rediscover its own role in the world. Labour MP Clive Lewis has argued that Europe as a whole could reset its relations with the rest of the world in the wake of Trump's exit. Again, that is very true, indeed. That is what all of Europe should now really be re-examining itself on this. As a piece in the US established journal, The Foreign Policy did recently suggest, quit NATO, strike a deal with Russia, and repair relations with China. Donald Trump and those around him have their vision for America first in the new world. The rest of us now need our own alternatives. There aren't any comments on this. Because I was told apparently there was some very negative comments. On this, not overly tanky. I mean, I think he gets the role of China in the Ukraine and these positions wrong. And I find it very worrying that he would say, "Where is it?" That oh yeah, we should expect more resource wars to break out. Because we're being constrained. Well, what exactly resource are we quote short on? um, there's a lot of assuming, I would say, going on in this article. I mean, he says at the bottom that he's an economist. He's not a foreign policy expert, but yeah, I think this guy is underestimated. I think what has gone on here. Certainly when it comes to sort of foreign policy thing, and again, it was supposedly, apparently, article could have upsides. I don't see where the upsides are. He hasn't spelt out what those upsides are, except, oh well, we're going to remake the world differently in a different system. Well, okay, what system should that be? What policy should we as Britain be pursuing to achieve those aims? So it's basically said nothing about what these upsides actually are or how we can achieve those upsides, except, well, it should be less exploitative and less, okay, well, how do you do that? What policy then should we then look at pursuing? And there's a lot of assumption there that, of course, China is a neutral actor, that Russia is somehow going to be okay with the bits of Ukraine that it has, that it's not going to come back. Future security guarantees in that respect as well. What about Europe? Who should it be looking at these new allies? Who should it be looking to? Um, a lot of assumptions, a lot of unanswered questions. not as tanky as I was expecting it to be. Um, but yeah, kind of bad when it comes to and a foreign policy analysis, and apparently on the world is going to be sort of remade, but thanks to Trump, and there's going to be these incredible upsides. Well, what are those upsides? If anything, I think the article is named wrong. Um, I think the article is completely has the wrong title, to be honest, because it's not really what it promises to the rest of the article. Um, but yeah, let me know what you think down below. Not as tanky as people were saying it was. Um, unless I don't know, this isn't the article because people were saying apparently they deleted it because they got a big pushback from it. Whether this is the article that was being discussed, I don't know. Like I say, this was the one that was sent to me. But yeah, not as tanky as I was saying. I think there's a lot of assumptions. I think there's a lack, I think, of foreign policy knowledge of what's going on in the Ukraine situation, what China's stance has been on Ukraine. Certainly, fundamental misunderstanding about what the Belt and Road Initiative is. That unlimited partnership really hasn't sort of come into effect too much, especially during the past 30 years, especially when China is buying like Russian oil at like knockdown prices. Not just them, but India as well. Do Modi and Putin have an unlimited deal as well? you know, um, so yeah, there's I think a lot of assumptions, a lot of questions there that raises, and or should I say, questions that would raise some stuff the article says and doesn't really answer a lot of that. But of course, as always, let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.